After publishing my impressions video on the alpha release of Shadow of the Road, I saw a comment expressing intense dismay at the revelation of that game being turn-based. And such comments are not all that rare when it comes to CRPGs. And I think it's worth discussing this topic, if only because it's one of the most salient points of discussion in all of CRPGs when it comes to combat. I am, of course, talking about the eternal war being waged between turn-based and real-time with pause combat. And very few people can agree about what is best in this case, apart from the people, of course, who partake in surveys. Many things have happened in recent years, and if you look at the broader landscape of CRPG surveys and polls and commentary from places such as Reddit or RPG Codex, the results are fairly clear, in favoring turn-based over real-time with pause, with results typically showing something like 60 to 70% of people preferring turn-based over real-time with pause. And I think there are good reasons for this. But I should also say at the outset that, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not partial to one over the other necessarily. I like both well enough, and I can appreciate both. And I can play and work with both as the need arises. In fact, what I ultimately like the most in terms of systems is what Owlcat did with Wrath of the Righteous, with a mixture of turn-based and real-time with pause, combining them into something that allows for a more precise and tactical experience. But enough about me. Let's first try to find answers to the question as to why most people prefer turn-based over real-time with pause. In the simplest of terms, the preference for turn-based combat often comes down to the perception of it offering more clarity, tactical depth, and perhaps, most importantly, player control. In terms of clarity, this can be understood as greater predictability in the sequence of attacks and actions. Things such as initiative and the outcomes of certain actions are much more clearly delineated when it comes to combat. You know exactly which character, be it the player character, enemy, or companion, is doing what at what time, and this can be a huge advantage to what is often perceived as the chaos of real-time with pause. Real-time with pause games, such as Pillars of Eternity, or the older Baldur's Gate games in the Infinity engine, obscure the timing of actions and events, and it's not always clear to the player whose turn it is to do something, even though, in a technical sense, you do have things such as rounds and turns in such games, especially in the original Baldur's Gate games. You just don't know, without extremely autistic familiarity with the systems, what exactly is going on. Now, clarity goes hand in hand with the feeling of greater player control, and frankly speaking, turn-based combat systems are significantly less stressful than real-time with pause. In the simplest of terms, turn-based allows players to take their time, and this serves as an important point of attraction to players who don't enjoy quick, Twitch-like reactivity and micromanagement, which is exactly what real-time with pause requires of players. You have multiple characters and actions going on the battlefield, and each of these needs to be managed to a T for optimal results, especially on the hardest difficulties. And beyond this, in order to effectively manage this system of play, it requires, as the name implies, a lot of pausing, which can just be annoying to a lot of players. In short, real-time with pause can often give you the feeling of chaos, whereas turn-based conveys a feeling of order and predictability that many more people can appreciate. And of course, both of the aforementioned aspects come together to give the player a feeling of greater tactical control, which is to say, all these aspects feed off of each other to make the player feel better about turn-based combat. To a majority of people, turn-based combat just feels more tactical and methodical, almost akin to playing chess, as it allows them to analyze each step and move and strategize without time pressure or feeling rushed. Compare that to real-time with pause, and for most people, again, it feels chaotic and disorderly with huge amounts of constant micromanagement compared to turn-based combat. Finally, another less often cited factor could be the fact that turn-based CRPGs tend to better emulate the turn-based nature of many tabletop games and systems, and arguably in hindsight turn-based would have been better for games such as BG and BG2, since again, it would have reflected the actual nature of tabletop far better than real-time with pause. Now it's clear from online data that the majority of people who play CRPGs do prefer turn-based combat. That's not in question. But nonetheless, it remains important to ask the question as to why some people still prefer real-time with pause. Truth be told, I think a great deal of the preference for real-time with pause just comes down to nostalgia, and to a lesser degree, a kind of elitism or snobism that often accompanies said nostalgia. But there are some legitimate reasons why some people prefer real-time with pause over turn-based, and one such reason is just the pacing. Some people really prefer combat that is more sped up and reactive, and real-time with pause effectuates this far better than turn-based combat ever could. But despite this, we have to be honest and realize and acknowledge that real-time with pause has become niche, whereas at one point in time, it had been fairly standard in CRPGs, and that's definitely no longer the case. And from a sheer profit and accessibility perspective, I suspect we'll be seeing less and less of real-time with pause as time goes by. Whilst it's true that CRPGs have always been niche, there have been increased efforts in recent years to onboard new people and players onto the genre, and those few attempts that have been met with the most success are invariably turn-based, with the obvious elephant in the room here being Baldur's Gate 3. Now, whatever you think of Baldur's Gate 3, it has been a vast commercial hit, and inasmuch as it is a CRPG, it is the most successful one, commercially speaking, ever made to date. And you can add to that fact that various developers, who traditionally have been CRPG specialists, have been slowly moving away from real-time with pause. Although Pathfinder Kingmaker began with real-time with pause, a player-made mod with a turn-based option was made that was immensely popular, that later inspired Owlcat themselves to add an optional turn-based mode to Wrath of the Righteous, and Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader is exclusively turn-based. And Pillars of Eternity 2 later received a turn-based mode that was welcomed by many. On top of that, you have games such as XCOM and Wasteland 3, and it just seems like the trend will continue to be turn-based, if only because that's what sells. But if you think about it, it is kind of strange on some level, since plenty of games are pure action games, and action without pausing is the standard default way of playing them, with no pausing or turns. But for whatever reason, people who play CRPGs seem to prefer turn-based in the majority, and that is unlikely to change in the future. If anything, as mentioned earlier, turn-based will likely only increase in frequency as more and more CRPGs are made. And as I said at the outset for myself, I don't really have a personal preference, and I can enjoy both systems, and I do think that many CRPG aficionados feel the same way. But when push comes to shove, I think turn-based, for better or worse, is the future of CRPGs. But as always, thank you for tuning in, and if you like my content and you like my takes, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. It's much appreciated, as it really helps out the channel, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.